moderator untuk Profesor Barkhuizen. Ya, sebelumnya saya mungkin memperkenalkan Profesor Barkhuizen. Professor Barkhuizen is one of the experts on the qualitative research. Then this is the book that written and edited by Professor Barkhuizen. Yeah, so this is the two books. Professor Barkhuizen was born in South Africa, and then he graduated from South Africa University, and then he continued his study in I just Columbia University in New York. Ya, jadi kemarin diskusi dan ngobrol dengan beliau. Beliau berada di riset yang sama sudah selama 20 tahun. Jadi sangat menarik sekali dan alhamdulillah saya dapat hadiah buku ini, mungkin kita bisa pelajari bersama. Okay. So I think this is the introductions for Professor Barkhuizen. Professor Barkhuizen, today there are also university students, master students, and undergraduate students that trying to write about the thesis about and using narrative inquiry. Okay, maybe we can have some kind of discussions, and then there will be a lot of questions and comments about this, and the time is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for the introductions. I feel very welcome now after those long introductions. It's great to be here. I'm looking forward to the time we got together, another hour or so. I'm going to give you a very broad introduction to narrative inquiry, to narrative research, just an overall broad introduction. And then you can take from that what is useful to you. I'm not here to tell you how to do it or what you must do, because everyone lives in different places, right? And everyone works in different disciplines. And everyone works with different students, and everyone works and lives in different ways. And so I'm not here to preach to you what you must do and how you must do it. I'm here to tell you about what narrative inquiry is in the field of language teaching and learning. And it's up to you to say, oh, that's interesting, I'll take a bit of that, I'll take a bit of that, I'll take a little bit of that, because it's useful for me in the places where I work and where I do research. Or it's possible for me to do a little bit of research in the topic that I'm interested in, right? So what I plan to do today then is to give you an overview about what narrative inquiry is. I'll do a little bit of talking. You'll do a little bit of work as well. And I'm not just going to sit down, or I'm not just going to stand here, because if I sit down, I can't think. I've got to move around. So I'm going to walk around, and I've got someone to help me with the changing of the slides. But an opportunity for you to ask questions. You can ask me questions anytime. And we've got a little bit of text to work on later as well, with a little bit of analysis that we can do. And we'll see how it goes. If I'm going too fast, just tell me to slow down. If I'm going too slowly, tell me to go a little bit faster. Okay? I'm quite happy to interact as much as possible. I'd like just to start with this first slide. If you could just change the slide there. And that says that narrative inquiry is about stories. And that is what distinguishes narrative inquiry from all other types of research, whether it's qualitative research or quantitative research or any other type of research. The narrative inquiry is about stories. Now, that sounds simple, but there's 1,000 questions you can ask about what that means, all right? So what I'm going to do is straight away, I'm going to ask you, just for 1 minute, with the person next to you, it's a workshop, right? You're going to be working again. So, with the person next to you, to come up with one question that you have about that. You don't have to ask me the question. I just want you to write down one question that you have about that. And then later on, we'll have a look at some questions. Not now, later on. So with the person next to you, just one, not each your own one. What question do you have about that? Narrative inquiry is about stories. So, what question do you have? Just quickly, one minute. So, narrative inquiry is about stories. Narrative inquiry is about the experience of the storytellers. So, in narrative inquiry, you get people telling stories. I'm saying people. I'm keeping it very general because the people could be the research participants, but who else could it be? Who else could be telling stories?
Everyone, I think. Everyone.
The research participants, but who else? The researcher. Yeah, so I'm keeping it broad. But narrative inquiry is about the experience of the storytellers. So number one, it's about stories. And number two, we want to know about the experience of the storytellers. And usually we're interested in the research participants, whether we are studying, investigating teachers or learners or whoever research participants are. We want to know about the experience that they've lived, or even experiences that they imagine in the future. We want to know about their experiences, right? From their perspective. So, they're telling us stories about their experience. We want to know from their perspective. Not what we think about it or what other people think about it. We want to know, in narrative inquiry and researchers, about their experiences that they've lived from their perspective. Alright? So that's important. From their perspective. And the meaning they make of those experiences. So how they understand those experiences. That is important. So it's the stories they tell. The stories about the experience that they have lived, whether it's the teaching experiences or their language learning experiences or any other experiences, maybe experiences of being an immigrant or the experiences of studying abroad or the experiences of having a child or the experiences of whatever the case may be, from their perspective and the meaning they make of those experiences. You see, that is important with research, right? Narrative inquiry understands that when we live our lives, all of us live our lives, we live experiences. The events, the experiences that we live. And then the next day we wake up and we lived a whole lot of experiences the day before. And then the next day, all these experiences that we lived. But those experiences have gone. All right, they've gone. We can't get them back as researchers. You can video them, you can record them, but it's not the same. Those experiences have gone. But what we want to do is to understand how our research participants understand those experiences, how they remember them, how they evaluate them, how they feel about them, their emotions in relation to those experiences. So what do? We ask them to tell us about those experiences. Or in an interview, or we ask them to write about it in a journal or a diary. All right? So we've got the discourse, we've got the narration, the writing, or the telling of their understanding of the experience. All right? So with narrative inquiry and all qualitative research, what we're doing as researchers is asking them to tell us about their understanding of the experience. We can't get to the experience because that's gone. In narrative inquiry, we don't try. We're interested in the meaning that the research participants make of their experiences, how they understand those experiences, how they evaluate them, how they feel about them, how they reflect on them. Okay. Does that make sense so far? So that in a nutshell is what narrative inquiry tries to do. I'm going to try and pull that apart a little bit, try and explain it in a little more detail. So, when it comes to making sense of those experiences, as narrative inquirers, often we collect stories. And that's quite easy to do. We can ask people to tell us stories, we can interview people, they can tell us stories. We get students to write stories about their experience, they can keep a journal about their experience and so on. And that's great. But then what do we do with them? What do we actually then do? And that's often the problem with narrative research, is how do we go about, as researchers, analyzing the stories? What do we do next? That's often the issue. So, just do the next one as well. Okay? So there are usually two options, and we'll come back to this in more detail later. One of them is looking at the data, looking at the stories as data, and analyzing them. So we can look at, there are many ways of analyzing them. We can do a thematic analysis or a content analysis. We can analyze them for the language. We can analyze the stories for their structure in order to understand our topic, in order to understand the focus of our research, right? And what we can do is construct stories from the data. So as researchers, we look at our data, we analyze it, understand it, and then we write stories based on that data. So in narrative inquiry, one of the options for the researcher is to configure or to construct stories from the data. You can do both. That's why I say and or, because you can do both. So you can get data, which could be stories, could be interviews, it could be whatever. You can analyze that, looking for themes, looking for however you analyze that. But what you can also do is you can construct stories. So from the traditions of anthropology and sociology, even psychology, nursing, social work, from the early traditions and in general education, the early traditions that included, or involved rather, writing stories of the participants' lives. Maybe, maybe patients, if it's in social work or psychology or in nursing. You write stories, and in the early ethnographic studies, there was often a narrative component as well, where the researcher writes stories based on the data. These are not just any old stories. These are stories that come from the analysis of the data. All right. So these are two other options. So this concludes my little introduction to narrative inquiry, and we're going to get to more detail later. But do you have any questions now? Perhaps one of the questions that you wrote down. Does anyone have a question that you have to ask me?
Right. Thank you. My question is, how could I trust the story?
Huh?
How could I trust the story told by the participant?
How could you write it? How could you? Trust. Okay.
The story.
So, this is interesting. In every workshop I do, that's always the first question. And I always have 3 responses, okay, to that question, and they're very nice responses to it. One of the responses is that what we are interested in is that in narrative inquiry, we're interested in the meaning that the participants make of their experiences, more so than the actual experiences, because we can't really get to the actual
experiences anyway, right? So we are interested in how the participants understand their experiences, how they make sense of them, how it's important to them and how they want to share it with you as the researcher. So that's one answer. In narrative inquiry, that's what we want to do. How people make sense of their life. And that is what we're interested in our research. The second response to your question is that when we work with participants in a research relationship, researcher and your participants, we expect a certain amount of trust with our participants. That when they agree to do research with us, in any research, narrative, qualitative research, ethnographic research, we expect them to cooperate with us. And so we don't expect them to lie to us. Why would they want to lie to us? You know, I mean, they form an agreement with us as research participants. And we trust them to cooperate with us in that relationship. And often usually narrative inquiry only has a few participants because you work with a lot of data with the one person. You only have one or two. You don't want to have many participants where you want to generalize. That's experimental research. That's not what this is, right? Okay, and then the third response I have is that participants can lie in any type of research if they want to. You know, if they fill in a questionnaire, for example, and I use this example all the time. If it says, they give you a statement, you know, strongly agree, neutral, disagree, strong, you know, you can lie, you can put anything there. Why do you trust that, but you don't trust them in telling you a story? You know? So, you know, so that, you know. I mean, sometimes, do I agree or do I strongly disagree? I strongly disagree. But you trust that because you put it into SPSS and then you get the stats. You know, oh yeah, that's right. That's going to be right. But you don't trust the story. So those are the three responses I always have. But the main response is really that we want to know how people experience their lives and the meaning they make of their lives, and that's what we offer. Because we understand that the actual experiences are very difficult, if not impossible. They're gone. Okay. And any other questions that you have that you wrote down? Yeah. So is it possible that the researcher tells his or her own stories as well? Well, with narrative inquiry, it's a wonderful opportunity for researchers to do that. Okay? So with narrative inquiry, you are not trying to be objective. You can't be. You can't. How can you be objective? This is not experimental research or positivistic research or cross-sectional. This is dealing with people's lives. And you as the researcher, if you're interviewing them or observing them, you are right in there with them. And you have to say in your research how you are in the midst, how you are participating with your researchers in the co-construction of those stories. So when you interview somebody about their life experiences, you don't only look in the interview to see what they say, you see what you say as well, so that you see how the story is co-constructed. So if you do an interview with somebody about, let's say you're interested in their teacher identity, and you do an interview with them about their early career as a teacher, and you ask them, tell me about when you first started teaching. And they say, well, when I started teaching, that was the first school I went to. They say, oh, where was that school? Oh, the school was at such and such. You are participating. When you say, where was that school, right? You are participating in their story. And so you can't take yourself out of the story. You are co-constructing the story with them. And so very often, you are quite involved. But there is I will get to it a little little later. There's a term called tellership. Teller, how much the researcher is involved in the telling of the story. So sometimes you'll be talking to someone in normal life, not even in interviews, in normal life. Someone says, well, I've got a story to tell you. I've got a story. And I say, oh, what happened? And then they just talk. They tell you the story, and you just sit there, right? And the story comes. We all know people, right? And so, but other times, when the story, you participating a lot. So the audience is very involved in the story. So the co-construction, you are telling the story with the person, not telling the story to the person. So that also is taken into account. So sometimes there's a lot of participating. So how much you engage with the participants as a researcher, it can vary to almost none, to a lot. And some would argue it should be a lot.
So is it possible that we also constructing meaning? I mean, we
Yeah.
not meaning from there something.
Yes, so the researcher is in the process of constructing meaning at the same time as the participant is constructing meaning. You are co-constructing meaning in the process of generating the stories. I call that narrative knowledging. Narrative knowledging. So you're creating knowledge, you're generating knowledge. It's a verb, knowledging. I'll show you a diagram a little bit later. Narrative knowledging. Okay, let's take one more question and then we'll change slides.
Like story life of the people. Story actually take from the story of the life of the people.
To make a story. Yes, so that's that bottom, the bottom one there. So you collect information about a particular person or a group of people, and then you write a story based on that data. Important though, it's not just you make up a story, it's based on the data. So it's research, all right? And that's important. Narrative inquiry it's rigorous research, systematic research. It's not just making things up. It's very systematic research, and it's quite difficult. It's quite difficult to do this. Because in constructing a story based on data about someone's life, or about a classroom activity, or about an immigration experience, or about teacher identity, it's got to be focused on the topic. It's got to be based on your research questions. It's got to be drawing on relevant theory. All right, if it's a research project you're doing, it's got to be drawing on research theory. It's got to be drawing on other people's literature in the field. It's not just writing a story. Okay, so that's very important. But again, it depends what the purpose is. So for teacher reflection, if you want pre-service teachers to reflect on their practicum or on their activity, then they can just write about their experiences. It's much more fluid in that case. Okay, so let's just have a look at this quote. This is one of my favorites. This is from Crack, and she's talking about what stories are. She says, stories assist humans to make life experiences meaningful. So this is where the stories help you to make sense of your life experiences. And I'm sure we all know people, I mean, we all do this, right? People tell stories all the time. And when you tell stories, you understand, you begin to understand more the experiences that we learn. They preserve our memories. I mean, how do we pass on our cultural information from one generation to another? Through stories about our culture. That's how we do it. We put our memories into stories, and then we share stories. How do we share stories throughout an institution, throughout a school, or throughout a department, throughout a university? Through stories. That we remember people, we remember events, we remember traditions through stories, right? They prompt our reflections. So when we tell stories, we don't just tell the facts, we also reflect on those facts. Right? It's not just this happened, then that happened, then that happened, then that happened. We also express our feelings about what happened. We evaluate the events that happened. All right? They connect us with our past and present. So through the stories we tell, we remain connected to our past, not only individually, but even particular cultures. Through the stories that we tell and we share, it keeps us connected to the past, connected to who we are now, and help us to envision our future. We imagine our futures. How many of us don't tell stories? We all tell stories about the future, about how we imagine ourselves in the future, or how we imagine ourselves in other places. We tell stories through envisioning, imagining ourselves. You know, I'm doing a degree at university because I imagine myself doing this in the future. I know what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be doing this with these people in that place. That's where I'm going to be working. I imagine myself doing that. So the stories help us to make sense of future experiences as well as past experiences. So my question is, if this is the case, then why shouldn't we use stories in research? It makes sense that to do research, if this is the case, stories then seems to be a really useful way. Okay, can you just change the slide? All right, so any further questions? If you look at the question that you wrote down, has that question been answered yet? If your question has been answered, can you put your hand up? Your question hasn't been answered yet? Really? Oh no! Still got a lot to do. Okay. Right. So I've been talking quite a bit. So we should be able to work through this quite quickly. This framework is from an edited book I put together, which consisted of 12, 13 chapters that people wrote about narrative research. And it was based on studies that they had done using narrative research. And they raised issues about narrative research in the studies that they did, right? It was a book called Narrative Research in Applied Linguistics, that was published in 2013 by Cambridge University Press. And when it came time for me to write the introduction to the book, I said, what am I going to say about these chapters in the book? And I thought, let me focus on the analysis, the way they went about analyzing their narrative data. And so I thought, let me go right back to the beginning and try to come up with a framework that somehow captured the way that all of them went about analyzing their data. So they all got some data, right, in their studies, and they went about showing in their chapters how they analyzed the data. They would capture all those different ways that they analyzed their data. Because remember early on, I said, often with narrative inquiry, we end up collecting stories. We end up collecting data, and then we say, now what do I do with it, right? So this book aimed to focus on the analysis of that data. And so I'm going to work through these lines step by step, and you're going to also do some thinking about what they mean, right? Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go line by line. If you have a look at this like that, you can see that each dimension is a continuum. There's an arrow on each end. So any type of study or analysis would lie somewhere along the continuum. Sometimes more towards this end, sometimes more towards that end. You all follow? Okay? So if the researcher looks at their analysis and says, where does my analysis lie? Is it more on this end or more on this end? For each of those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 dimensions. So they should be able to plot their analysis along those dimensions. And I've called it more or less. So are they more on this end? Or, no, sorry, or less? So they'd be more on that end. So just for a minute, just with your partner, just make sure you understand the concept of this framework before I start working through it. I just want to make sure you know what we're doing next. So have an opportunity just to discuss that. Okay.
Excuse me, Professor.
Yeah.
Can I use a creativity for story with these pictures? If I have a story something, can I use a creativity for this epistemology and
Not really.
Not really.
Not really. This is more to just try to give you an overview of the different types of analysis that narrative inquirers use. And so the different types of analysis, right, you should be able to say, if I'm doing this type of analysis with my narrative data, with my story data, it's over there, or it's on that line, on this line. So it's a way of identifying the type of analysis that you are doing. And I want to just demonstrate the types of analysis. So it's not, this isn't a method. This isn't a method. It's just describing the different types of analysis.
not only,
Huh?
not only all, but sometimes there are many in epistemology and
Yeah, I'm going to work through those now. I'm going to go through each one.
if I analyze a big data, this one until it's
Yeah, I'm going to go through each one, and then just to describe that any study, you should be able to say where you are on each line. Okay, so if you were doing a narrative inquiry, you should be able to say where you are on each line. Okay. So just have a little discussion to make sure you understand what this is. Otherwise, I don't want you to be lost. Okay, I think there may be some confusion. What I'm saying is that there are many different ways of doing narrative inquiry. There are many different ways, right? There's no formula. As I said before, it's not SPSS, right? There's no steps. There's no one way of doing it. There are many different ways. And this just represents all the different ways that you can do it. So I want to work through and show you many different ways that you can do it. That's all. Okay? So that's all. So this is not step by step how you do it. This is not the step by step how you do it. This is showing you, I just want to demonstrate that when you do the analysis, when you look at your narrative, there are many, many different ways of doing it. So let's start with the first one. Okay? And this first one is epistemology. What does that mean? Epistemology. Epistemology. Very simply, how we know about the world, right? How we know about things. It's philosophy. I hate philosophy too, don't worry. It's just how we get to know about things. So, okay, so with epistemology, it's how do we know about the world? All of us. So, believing in narrative as a way of knowing about the world. Narrative as a mode of thought. So, if you believe that we know about the world through stories and through narratives, you would be on the more side of that dimension, not on the less. You'd be on the more side. So narrative guides researchers' approach to research, both its theoretical and its methodological procedures. So if you're doing narrative inquiry, you would believe that we know about things through story, through narrative. So there was a famous a psychologist called Jerome Bruno. Some of you may have heard of him. And he believed there were two ways of knowing about the world. And one way was through very systematic categorizing the world. So we break down, we see different animals and we say, oh, that's a dog, that's a cat, that's a lion, but there's a lion and a cat and a tiger. They're quite similar. So we break the world down into similarities and differences. So more systematic ways. And that's how we live. How we know. We got a room, and we've got a big room, a small room. One's a lecture room, the other is a bedroom, another is a kitchen room. So we break down the world by categorizing. Another way is that we put things together, like narrative. You put things together into stories. So you've got people and places and ideas, everything, you put it together. So if you look, you've got people, how they interact in different places over time. So instead of breaking things down and separating them, you put it all together. So narrative inquiries believe that we can understand the world through the particular, through putting things together. Like qualitative researchers, in a way. We want to understand everything. So when we go and do ethnography, okay, and we want to go to investigate a classroom or a school, we try to make sense of everything. The teachers, the learners, the classroom, the school principal, we want to make sense of all of it. We don't break it apart and say, I just want to know the learners in this group. And then this learner doing this task with this test, where we try and break it down. With narrative, you try and put it all together. So if you believe that, then that will guide your research approach, the way you go about doing research. And so this is just a more philosophical one. So that first line, epistemology, is on the more, meaning narrative inquiries will usually be located on the more side of that dimension, because they would be believing more so that we make sense of the world narratively through story. Okay? So then the thing is, when you're going to do a research project, you will do a narrative research project because you believe stories will help you understand the world. Because, that's how we make sense of the world, epistemology. And therefore, your methods that you will use will be methods that are compatible with a narrative epistemology. So if you are doing a narrative inquiry, will you set up an experiment? No! You will use methods that are compatible with narrative way of knowing about the world. So what will you do? You'll do narrative interviews. You'll interview people. You'll say, tell me about your life experiences. Tell me about your first year as a teacher, or your first week, or tell me about your language learning experiences. Okay, so it's tell me your stories, or written stories in teacher journals. Those are the methods. Keep a journal, a reflective journal, over the course of this semester. Or visual stories. Visual narratives are becoming very popular now with narrative inquiry. Using visual narratives, using multimodal narratives, using stories on social media, and using stories on YouTube and so on. There's a lot of interesting visual narratives and multimodal narratives, the way we move, the way we dance, the way we make movies. All of these type of narratives are now being used. And of course the researcher writing stories. So these over here, these are all types of narrative methods. And these are all compatible and fit together with a narrative epistemology. In other words, you agree that we make sense of the world through stories. All right? So nothing unusual. making sense. It all fits together. Now, this is important. With this dimension, more or less, the people, researchers, inquirers, who want to analyze the data, focus more or less on the content of the story. Yep, you can change. So, what the stories are about. So many of us are interested in what the stories are about. So if you go to someone and say, oh, I've got an amazing story to tell you what happened yesterday. They say, oh, what happened? What is it about? What happened? Well, yesterday this happened and that happened. That's what the story is about. Who are the narrators and the other people in the story? So who are the characters? Who are the people? How do they relate to each other? What are they doing together? Where are they doing it? When are they doing it? Why are they doing it? This is the content, what the story is about. But surprisingly, some narrative inquirers pay less attention to the content. Others pay more attention to the content. More or less. This dimension, more or less. All right? I'm very interested always in the content of stories. That is my research interest. So I'm always situated, the next one. I'm always interested in number 3 on the more side of the content rather than the less side. But look at number 4. This dimension has to do with the form, with the structure of narrative, of the story. The structure of the narrative. Who would be interested in the form of the story, do you think? What type of researcher would be interested in the way the narrative is formed? Who would be interested? The what?
The message form.
No. Who? What type of researcher?
Oh.
What type of researcher would be interested in the structure? Just the next one. So, for example, what language is used? How the story is structured? What information comes first? Who talks? Then who talks next? Who overlaps? Who interrupts? Okay? Linguists. Sociolinguists. Do we have any linguists here? No linguists. Any sociolinguists? Any discourse analysts? Well, those people would be interested in the form, the structure. So, what does the story look like? You know, what information comes first? Then what information comes? But usually, all narrative inquirers are interested in a bit of both. So you're never that end of the continuum. You're usually somewhere along the middle somewhere. Okay. So, okay, do you get that? So some researchers are interested, like people who do linguistics. They'll go and record someone, and they'll take an excerpt of the recording, and they get all excited. They say, here's the story. Let me analyze the story. Oh, they analyze the story because you've got this structure, then that structure, then this is said, and this overlaps with this structure. And they look at how the story is structured from a linguistic perspective. Okay? Other people are more interested in what are they saying in the story? What's the story about? All right? And then you do an analysis of the content of the story to see what it's about. Okay. I think I'm going to do that one. So, 5, next one, there 6. Yeah, okay. No, yeah, 6. I'll leave the social practice one. The social practice one, there's a small group of people at number 5 who are interested in both the form and the content, but also how stories are part of a social practice. So they study the story, but they also look at what's happening in the context around the story. So it's like quite similar to ethnography, but they focus very much on the text of the story. But they want to see how, what else is going on, what purpose that story serves in a particular community. Either for community building or, this is the work of anthropologists would be really interested in this. How that story works, not only in the story, but as part of a society, part of a community. It's a bit complex to explain. The co-construction, this is the story, this is the question you were asking about how much involvement the researcher has. So, yeah. So it referred to as tellership, the telling stories to someone and telling stories with someone. So how much co-construction takes place? Okay. The level of participation of the audience. I want to just go through the last two quite quickly, and then we'll do a little bit of exercise, a little bit of work on the one in front of you. Okay, let's zip through these. Number 7 is categorization. Have any of you ever done a thematic analysis of a piece of text? This is what this is. So this is, next slide. This is simply, you identify themes in the story or in the data, and themes are like concepts in the data. This is quite straightforward. You categorize the themes, and you look for pattern amongst the categories. So this is one way, simply a thematic analysis or a content analysis. And this is done very commonly in narrative inquiry as well, usually on stories. So you have stories that you collect in your data, and then this is quite straightforward. You do a thematic analysis. So you can do more of it or less of it, more or less. Some people argue that a content analysis is not really enough, because you need also to pay attention to the form, to the language much more, and to the context, the actual context in which the story was generated. So, and that context includes not just the context of the storytelling, but the macro context, the big political context, ideological context as well. All right? And then the last one has to do with storying. This is constructing a story from the data. Okay? And I mentioned this right at the beginning. This is configuring a story from the data, what someone's called emplotment. In literature, you've got a plot in a story. What's the plot? What happens over time? So you've got constructing a story based on the data. It's not just any old story. The story is focused on your research topic, based on your research questions. It's a sort of theory-focused story, a research story. And that represents your findings. The story that you write represents your findings. So it's a very powerful research story. Okay. So, are there any questions? Based on, yeah.
Is it possible sometimes we have to choose study, for example, or for constructions before having sustainable physics?
Okay, so next one. So that's quite a good question, because when I put this together, I said, so what's the good? What's the purpose of this framework? Well, the purpose of the framework, I think, is quite useful to, when you're designing a study, to ask yourself beforehand, where do I fit along each dimension? Where, if I had to plot myself, where am I more or less, there's no exact point, but more or less there, and then just to get you to think about your design. Is this design appropriate for the purpose of my narrative inquiry? So it's not going to give you an answer, it's just going to get you to reflect a little bit on the design of your study. Okay? So you need to think, what's the purpose? What's the purpose of what I'm doing? And then you answer the question that you asked. So am I doing a self-reflection for my own professional development? Am I doing a dissertation or a thesis? Am I doing a study because I've got a research grant and I need to do 2 publications in 2 top journals. Am I writing a book based on a big research project? You know, what is the purpose and what's the outcome? You know, so that will help determine the design of the study. And you also need to consider who the audience is. Who's the audience of your study? Who are the ones going to be reading the outcome? And so you need to have in mind, right at the beginning, when you're designing the study, what it's going to look like based on the outcome and who is going to be receiving that outcome. The purpose, the outcome, and who's going to be receiving it. And so I have this, sorry, let me just go ahead here. I'm going to jump through stuff because I have this thing called narrative knowledging. And this refers to that meaning making in doing narrative inquiry, in doing narrative research, the meaning making. So, and this is your answer to your question as well. Narrative knowledging is the meaning making, learning, or knowledge construction that takes place during the narrative research activities of co-constructing narratives. That's when you're collecting data, analyzing narratives, reporting the findings, and then reading, watching, listening to research reports. So when someone is reading the outcomes, they are also narrative knowledging. Okay? So if you look at it diagrammatically, let's say, for example, you are a researcher and you are interviewing a teacher about her teacher identity. All right, that's the study. So the narrator will be the teacher and the audience will be the researcher. So the researcher is interviewing the narrator, the teacher. And you see the arrow goes both ways. So they're co-constructing the interview data, working together. When the narrator is talking about her experiences as a teacher, she is narrative knowledging. She is making sense of her experience. Remember we said right at the beginning, when you tell stories, you make sense of your experience. The researcher, while listening to the interview, is also narrative knowledging, because the researcher, they narrative knowledging together. While they're doing that, the interview is taking place. They're co-constructing the interview, and they end up with an interview, or a series of interviews. So that's the narrative data. All right? Then the researcher has to analyze that data. And whatever method you use, focus on form, focus on content, focus on practice, whatever. When the researcher is analyzing that data, they are narrative knowledging. They are making sense of that data. They're making sense of that data. All right? Maybe in doing that, they have to go back to the narrator. So they're making sense of the data. The data represents the teacher's experience. So in analyzing the data, the researcher is narrative knowledging about the experience of the teacher. Then the researcher writes the research report, which could be an academic article, it could be a dissertation, it could be a short report for a newsletter, it could be a report for a web page, it could be a YouTube channel report, it could be. But when you are writing that report, you are narrative knowledging, because you've got to figure out what do I put in this report. And you've got to understand and do narrative knowledging about the experience of the teacher, your topic. Then you end up with a report, and then someone reads it. And when they are reading it, they are also narrative knowledging. They are also making sense, interpreting the experience of the teacher. And that's your aim. Your aim as the researcher is to report your interpretation of the experience of the teacher. And so, Arifa, when you are planning your project, it's important to keep all of this in mind. Because when who are these people going to be? What is this going to look like? How am I going to do this analysis? What is the data going to be? How much of it is it going to be? Who is the teacher going to be? How many teachers do I need? So you need to keep the purpose, you need to keep all of this in mind. That's why I rather like this idea of narrative knowledging, because it's the constant meaning making, back and forth, narrative knowledging throughout the project, right? Even when you're planning the project, all the way through. Does anyone have any questions about this? Yeah.
Okay. I will talk about this. I want to ask you about the role of the audiences in this case.
Yes.
The teacher, the narrator, especially in the co-construction.
Yeah.
Co-construction. Yeah. Am I right if I say that the role of the researcher is to help the narrator to shape their experience?
Well, not to help them, they do shape the experience, definitely, based on the design of the study, on the types of questions they ask, on the way they collect the data. Of course, they very much, just going back to your question, very much involved right through to the stage of the report, and the way they design the report, and the way they write the report.
Based on the fact that sometimes the narrator has difficulty in expressing.
That's right. Yes.
So the researcher needs to have been heard.
That's right. That's right. And there a whole lot of questions are raised because there are limitations of language.
Yes.
So for everybody, there are limitations of language. If you're trying to describe an experience that happened, language can only describe so much. Any language, even your first language. But if it's an additional language, there are even more barriers, more constraints. All right? And so the narrator, the researcher may be able to help a bit.
Yes.
With the way, and then of course once they start doing that, then how much influence do they have? More or less influence in the shaping of the story. So yeah, but I mean the point is that in the writing of the report, all of that for the sake of trustworthiness needs to be disclosed. You say in your report, for the purposes of reliability or for trustworthiness, exactly what you did along the way. Yeah, that's right. Good, interesting question. Yeah.
So actually the final report
Yeah.
is actually not only come from the narrative, but also from the researcher.
Definitely. Yeah. And the final report, because reports can take different shapes, can be changed. So a final report, if it's an article and it's published, then it's very much stuck in a journal. But if it's a conference presentation, then there can be interaction with the audience, Or if it's an online presentation where there can be commentary, and then you can reply to the comments, so that can also be flexible. So what you do is in your interpretation, you say how you're going about the interpretation, and you show your evidence from the data. So you say, this is how I'm interpreting it because this is how I see it in the data. And then you can go back, those are double arrows. So you can go back to the participant and you can say, this is how I've interpreted, what do you think? Would you want to change something? Would you want to add something? And so you can take your interpretations back. In the draft of a research report. You can go back to the narrator and say, this is how I've written up the report in draft form. What do you think? Would you want to change something? Do you think,
and explain
Yeah.
based on the perspective of the
Yeah. You can do that. In fact, I published an article in 2016 where there were 4 short stories in the article that I commented on. And after my interpretation of each story, I sent it to the teacher. And she wrote her response to my interpretation and sent it back to me. And I included her response in the article.
Yes.
So it's got the story, my interpretation, and then her response to my interpretation. It's in TESOL Quarterly in 2016. Published in 2016. She did it for 3 of the stories. For one story she didn't do it because there were some cultural issues involved. But for the others she did it. They included in the actual published article. Okay, I want to just show you one type of analysis. In the past few years, I've been working with what I've called short stories. So, short stories are excerpts of data that are taken from interviews or from some written data and so on. And short stories, this is my definition of a story. So, we've been talking about stories all day. So, this is short stories. They're excerpts of data that are taken out of somewhere else, so it looks like a story, right? They narrate experience, so it's about the experience. They include reflective or evaluative commentary, so it's the narrator's evaluation of experience. There's a time dimension, things happen over time. There's some action in the story. And there's questions about who, where, and when. Who is in the story? Where did the story take place? And when did the story take place? And there's also the stories that call it tellability. They're interesting. Something interesting in the story. Next. So, short stories are analyzed for their content and also for their context. So I'll give you a little demonstration and then we'll do some analysis as well with the example that you've got. Short stories are analyzed for their content, what is in the story, and also for the context. We'll talk about that. The context, where the story took place on a sort of contextual level. Okay, we'll move quickly here. Firstly, when looking at the content of the story, we ask the question, who is in the story? Where does the action of the story take place? And when? So, if you have your short story and you start working through it, so what you've got in front of you on the handout is a short story. Okay? Is there a spare copy of the handout? Do you have a spare copy? Okay. So if you look at the short story, and I'll tell you about the short story in a minute. You can ask questions about who is in the story, where did the action of the story take place, and when did the action of the story take place. Okay? So, who simply means the narrator, the other characters in the story, what's their relationship, and on various scales, you know, sort of, are they intimately related or are they more distantly related, and so on. Where, look at the places, sequences of places, and again on varying scales. So we can talk about in this room, in this university, in Solo, in Indonesia. So big scales or small scales, right? So when we talk about where, those big scales and small scales. And then when, past, present, and future, but we can talk about 1 hour ago, or yesterday, or 5 years ago, or 10 years, or 20 years. So big scales of when in the past, but also in the future. And then you can go through line by line and look for when, explicit mention of when. And if you put them into a three-dimensional space, that creates the space of the story. This is very, very simple. It's a very simple way of looking at a short story and focusing on the content by asking who is in the story, where does the action take place, and when does the action take place. And then looking at those three together.
Who, where, and when. All right, and then what we do is we focus on the context. So first is the content, now we focus on the context. And the first level of context is story on all small letters, looking at the micro context. So imagine a teacher in her classroom. So, or this micro context here. Here we are in this micro context. Me and you, or a teacher in her classroom with her learners, a micro context. Okay, so, you know, the small space, okay? You know, there it is, a small space, okay? But then we can have story with a capital S. This is moving out now. The contextual space moves out. No, not yet, sorry. Meso spaces, like classroom is in the school, the staff room, the faculty room, the neighborhood, even the local community. And in terms of time, not just today, but moving outwards in terms of time scale. Okay, so there we see story with a capital S, moving outwards, and we can move out even more, where we have story with capitals. These are the broader ideological spaces. So, you know, these have become the big sociological, cultural, political spaces. So if you think about the teacher in the classroom is within a school, but the school is following a curriculum or syllabus that comes from, you know, maybe the government, maybe the state. And there's certain methods and assessments that have been decided upon by, you know, researchers, internationally, global researchers, these big ideological spaces, the big context. So when we're doing the analysis, we don't only just focus on, oh, here's the teacher in her classroom, but we've got to think about it. It may not be in the story, but as a researcher, you've got to think about how this connects to these broader, bigger stories that are going on, in much bigger macro cases. So if you've got your content, who, where, and when, and then you superimpose the context onto it, that creates a narrative space. That's the focus of your analysis, right? So when you get a short story, you've got to be reminded. You've got who, where, and when, and then you've got these expanding contexts. It's not simply just the micro. Because if you focus only on the micro, you're not learning enough about the experiences of the learner. To get a fuller picture, a more important picture, you need to expand outwards to understand what's really going on. Okay. Okay. Skip that one. Yeah, okay. Yeah. And then, no, okay. Yeah. And you add stories. You add stories and stories, and then you get the bigger picture of the topic. So we're looking at one short story here. Let's have a look. This is Anna. She works in Colombia in South America. And she's an English teacher. She's also a teacher educator. And she works 2 or 3 jobs, you know? Sometimes you've got to work 2 or 3 jobs to make some money to live. And so she works, but that's not what she wants to do. She wants to work full-time in one university. And so to get tenure, to get full-time researcher, teacher in one university. And so she saw a job was advertised at this university. And so look what she says. She says, well, they opened some posts, they advertised some posts. Now think about it. This is a story, right? This is a story. And I would apply for it. But they said that I was not prepared. I mean, I was not prepared because I didn't have research. So she didn't get the job because she didn't have research. Line 5. Because I didn't have this and that. Because your only piece of research is the one that you did for your master's degree. And I was like, oh, so I'm not enough. And what I have done is not enough. And so I said, oh. So you can see she was angry. She was frustrated. She said, oh, I'm not enough. Meanwhile, she's a very experienced teacher. She's been teaching for many years. She's an excellent teacher. And she's done some action research with her students. She even had an action research group. But no, that's not enough. So what do you think they want at the university? They want publications. What type of research do they want? They want research that's got funding. They want publications in top journals. That's the type of research they want. So she says, oh, in line 10. So I was thinking, maybe I should study a PhD. Okay, so that's her reason. I was interested in this study. These were students who were doing, there were 7 students in the study. They were all doing a PhD. All experienced teachers. And I was interested in their changing identity as experienced teachers now doing a PhD. And so I was interested in how their identities were changing as teachers. And she said, oh, maybe I should do a PhD. Because like having a master's will never be enough if I want to work in a full-time position in a university. I am aware that I didn't have time to carry out research because like I was just able to work, like I was a language teacher, despite I was doing some training for teachers in action research and stuff. So when that happened, I was like, I should do research then as well. I should move. So I said, I'm going to do something. I'm going to do action research as well. So in the past, she did do some action research, which is perfect for professional development. That's what you should be doing, right? I should do some action research. And so I started like, what could I do? What could I research? And I said, well, when I was a supervisor, teachers were not happy with the supervision system. And they would do things to comply. And so I prepared a small-scale research, action research about peer coaching. So she describes a project that she did in the past. As I told you, I couldn't get the position of full-time teacher at the university. And that was so disappointing for me. And I said, I have to study again. I have to come back to research. Otherwise, no university will accept me. Because they expect that you are like publishing many things. And they want you to, how many articles have you published recently? I wrote a letter of complaint to say, how come you are not looking at me as a teacher? I mean, the fact that I'm not publishing or researching, that does not mean that I'm not a good teacher. And so they replied, you don't have much research experience. And so I was like, so as soon as I can get a chance, I will quit this job and then try to have a PhD program. Because I do want to become a full-time teacher somewhere, right? That's a very sad story. She didn't get the position because she didn't have enough research. But we just read it, we got a basic understanding of the story. But how can we get a good understanding of the story? All right, just if you have a look, this next one. Yeah, look at this. So, if you have a look what's in red, you ask the question, who? This is the analysis on content, focusing on content. If you ask the story, who? You've got, well, they opened some post. Who is they? The people at the university. Okay? They opened some posts. And I will apply for it. So, what we've got in the story, we've got they and we've got I. Already there's some tension. Okay? They from the university and I. So there's a dilemma, a tension set up in the story. Just by focusing on who in the first 2 lines. But then they said I was not prepared. So now the story, the content's unfolding. They said I was unprepared. I mean, I was not prepared. Because your piece of research, so you and them, it's this us and them, is set up all the way through. All the way through, and you can go through it. Just focus just have a look at the short story. See who else is in the story. Just do it by yourself or with the person next to you. Just circle all the people in the story. Just go through it quickly. Just very quickly. We don't have much time, but have a look. Okay, who else is in the story that we haven't mentioned? Just give us one or two. The teachers, that she was the supervisor of the teachers. So that again makes us all, frustrated because she's very experienced. She was a supervisor of other teachers. So why isn't she getting this job? Why? Okay, so thank you. Other people? Other who? Who else? There's many, many people. You can keep going through. Keep going through. I mean, look at line 33, because they expect that you are like publishing. That they is not only the people who advertise for this university job. Remember, you've got to move outwards. Move outwards. That it probably represents many universities around the world. Not only her country. In this neoliberal societies that we live in, where we are constrained and we are forced to do certain things like publish and publish and publish. That they is people who are running universities and running university systems in many parts of the world. So it's not only this particular university where she's applying. That they is a big they. It's part of the big story. So you see, as you go through it, you can make much more sense out of this story. If you look at the where, otherwise no university, line 32, no university will accept me. That's not the university she's applying in. That's any university. She's never going to be accepted. So you've got the university that did the advert. You've got any university in our globalized world that's not going to accept her because she doesn't have research that she's published. So she'll never become a full-time teacher. That last line, so I want to become a full-time teacher somewhere. That's another character in the story. That's an imagined person. Who? That's an imagined character in the story. So we've got Anna. She's got a past teacher where she was a supervisor. She's got a present teacher who was unsuccessful with the position. She's also got an imagined identity as someone who wants to be a full-time teacher in a university. But that's not attainable at the moment. So we've just been selected. But if you go through it line by line by line by line and start looking at who actually all the characters are, you can make a lot of meaning out of the story. A lot of meaning. Short story analysis. This is just one example, focusing on the content and also on the context, the story levels. Okay, so just go quickly. You see, no, back one. You see, these are the where, the sub-posts, the this and the that. And the next one, this is the time ones. They open time in the future and so on. I think that's all we got time for. Any last minute questions? This short story analysis works really well. You can do it with self-reflection. You can do it with your own action research projects. You can do it as part of dissertations or thesis. You can do it for academic articles. I've published a number of articles using short story analysis. So it's a very interesting and useful and systematic way of going about doing analysis.
The role of the theory in this narrative study. The role of the theory.
The role of theory. Well, I mean, I haven't spoken about that today, but one of my articles where I use short story analysis, I was looking at teacher identity, and I looked at it from the theoretical perspective of investment, using Bonnie Norton, her idea of investment, and she based that on Bourdieu's idea of capital. Different types of capital, symbolic capital, social, cultural capital, and so on, and investment. So my whole design of the study was all related to theory of investment. And so when I interviewed the participant in that study, I was interested in why she was investing in her teacher education. because I wanted to see what she expected to get out of her investment in the future, how she imagined her identity in the future. So, you know, different theoretical perspectives can be brought into the design and the study, sociocultural theory, identities, social identity theory, whatever, you know, community to practice, any theory that's appropriate to what your research questions are. Sure.
So, although nothing works about the story, but we still need verbal perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, absolutely, but again, it depends on the purpose. So if a teacher is interested just in some self-reflection and keeps a reflective journal they write in weekly, there is probably not that useful there. But if you want to do a dissertation or a thesis or an academic article, you have to have it. You'll never get it published otherwise, you know, because it's as rigorous as any other type of research. And as I said before, I was the editor of a journal called Language Teaching Research, which is a high-impact journal. And we used to get many narrative inquiries submitted to the journal, and we just would not accept them because there was no theoretical rigor at all. Lovely stories, fantastic, but they need to be shared amongst a smaller community of teachers or school administrators, but not rigorous if they have to.
There is certain format in reporting the narrative way. There is certain format in reporting.
It depends what type of narrative inquiry you've done. Yeah. I mean, there is an opportunity for alternative formats, but there are challenges because of conventions in journals and so on. I mean, I have tried to push the boundaries in my own work a little bit. Sometimes it gets thrown back. But sometimes it is successful. But generally, depending on where you want to publish, you are constrained by conventions of. But you can be like, you know, there are options for more visual presentations and other sort of, you know, poetry and so on. There are possibilities. Yeah. Okay, one more.
Some teacher teach in class about the subject content, for example, and then the audience is student, right? So the researcher gets some data from this story from the teacher. So how to get some direction from the student or from teacher to say this is good student, a good teacher, or this good student like this?
How to get some stories from them.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yes. When teacher gives the student,
Yes.
right? And this is a story or
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, we can ask the participants to write stories, either as part of their coursework, so you can build it into coursework, or they can write stories as, as part of a research project. So you give them guidelines for what to write and how to write it. And again, from observations or whatever, you, as a researcher, could write the stories. Do you see what I mean? Yeah, I think I've got your question.
yeah, you know, the teacher is a student and gives some story about the content.
Yes, yes.
And then the teacher with some information because this is data, right?
Yes, yes.
And then get some information. And this is so the conclusion is good teacher or not, anything like that, or
Yeah, well, you'd have to have definitions of what good teaching is. That's where the other literature comes in and other theory comes in. So you have to have definitions of what good teaching is, and depending on what your data is, then you match it against those definitions. You see? Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Barkhuizen. So, actually, this is new things for me, as the lectures that are trying to do more and more about narrative inquiry. It is not as a simple we think. We have to read and then trying to find this kind of how to analyzing the data. We have a lot of stories, but we have to learn how to categorize and then have such kind of thematic. My experience, I have a lot of discussions with my students, master students, and then we got something, wow, oh, this is what happens to the teacher. So it is like a happy ending for having a lot of discussion. So Bapak Ibu mungkin ini baru banyak di bahasa, namun tidak menutup kemungkinan bahwa ini juga bisa banyak cerita tidak hanya di kelas bahasa, namun juga kelas-kelas profesional, kelas-kelas teknik, ya, yang mungkin tidak terdeteksi selama ini. Banyak cerita di kelas-kelas kita yang kita bisa jadikan riset untuk para mahasiswa ataupun untuk artikel-artikel yang akan kita publikasikan. Okay, thank you very much for Professor Gary Barkhuizen. Barkhuizen, is it right? Yeah, Barkhuizen. It is Pak Gary Barkhuizen dari Jerman. Yeah, the ancestor is from the Germany. And also, he was born in South Africa because of the ancestors started to live in South Africa in 1716. Yeah, so it is long ago. Okay, we have photo sessions after this. Thank you very much for today. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.